there's an easy to understand example the confession itself brings up that I think will help people grasp what's going on here and how all power, all authority relationships really in creation have levels and responsibilities. The example it brings up is there's a father, and this is a very real example in wartime. I mean, if you're wishing for civil war in the United States, think about all the things that are going to come with that. Uh, in wartime, there's a father, this is their example, who needs money and protection. And so he offers to prostitute his wife and his daughters to passing soldiers. The confession says the wife and daughters would legitimately be justified in throwing stones at him so as to drive him off.
Nice.
That is the father, right?
Yes, nice.
So yeah, so this is the idea of what we would call, when we talk about like the Second Amendment in the United States, self-defense. That is, by virtue of existing, I have a right to preserve my own life. As the father of a family, I have the right to preserve the life of my wife and children. If the state wants to come in and take them away from me, I have a right to defend my authority against theirs. So there are always levels of authority within this historical context, because the Magdeburg Confession will be picked up largely by Reformed folks throughout Europe, especially the Huguenots in France, and from there will travel to the United States and be known as a doctrine to John Adams during our revolution. And that is the doctrine of lesser magistrates. That is kind of guys in the middle of the food chain, right? So they're not the emperor. They're not even necessarily a king, although in the case of, for instance, Luther's life, his life is preserved by a lesser magistrate. When he's declared an outlaw and he's, quote, kidnapped for his own protection, that's a lesser magistrate who's saying, the life of this man is legitimate, it's godly, I'm going to preserve it, even though the guy above me wants to kill him.
All right, so here's the question that cuts through all the ice in my world. Is the Godfather a lesser magistrate? I really mean it. I think okay. Every moral question gets put out in that question. Everything we could argue about is right there.
Yeah, I think something that's clarifying when you think about things like the Godfather or similar figures, sometimes called political bosses, sometimes mob bosses, it just depends on the group and the environment, is that America is not, certainly after the Civil War, is by virtue of just all the different groups that come to be here, America is not what you could biblically call a nation in the sense of sharing sort of a common descent, a common genealogy, a common place of origin, right? It might not even be that from the beginning. There are different takes on that, right?
Because we're not an ethne, though, right? We're a hegemonic economic military power, a private army owned by many.
We're always variegated. If you read David Hackett Fisher's book, Seeds of Albion, he'll even say that, because of the different parts of the British Isles, that different regional groups that are all here at the Revolution come from, America's never quite one thing. That's by the by. When you think about groups, you want to think like these groups might have different ways of representing themselves to the central government, or in our political terminology, the federal government. And we think of that, the states are different things. But biblically, you could even say like Italian Americans are kind of their own thing. This is not to say that Italian Americans are all represented by crime bosses. I honestly think that there's a lot of history there that's gotten lost.
They're represented by dinner clubs, local dinner clubs. Well, that's what they're represented by.
What I'm saying is everybody knows about Al Capone. Nobody knows about Meyer Lansky, even though Meyer Lansky was much more successful.
I mean, the question for me comes out of the actual movie, The Godfather. And when you watch the movie, his rise to lesser magistrate within his community, whether agreed upon by the Chicago whoever or not, was one of initially protecting the weak. They needed a magistrate, and he rose to it as a tribal leader, and that's how he became what he was. Now, it gets pretty awful as you look at the passing of it from father to son and what it does to the family. I mean, it's an amazing study in human sin and power and what it can do to us. But it begs the question, where does any of that power of authority come from to begin with? And at what point do I get to say to the mob boss who says he's my governor, no.
And the question of legitimacy is one that when you read Romans 13, it's not often the one that's brought up, right? We read Romans 13 to say, okay, submit to the governing authorities. But it also specifies there, well, what is a governing authority supposed to be doing? He's supposed to be rewarding good works and punishing evil. He does not bear the sword in vain. That's violent authority. Violence is not always wrong, per se. He bears violent authority so that goodness may be rewarded and evil punished. There are plenty of instances in human history where the top or the most powerful authority is doing the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, that's the claim of revolution, right?
Yeah. A lot of us might be in one of those situations right now. So recognize that the question of legitimacy is always going to be contested in the moment. Give you an example from the time of the Magdeburg Confession. The reason that Magdeburg is being besieged is because a key figure switches sides. He was within the group of Lutheran princes who agreed to defend the gospel by force if necessary, almost 20 years earlier. And his name is Maurice, and he switches sides because he's offered his cousin's territory by the emperor if the emperor is successful in war.
Dude.
This is something else to realize, is that elites will often actually destroy their own group if it means that they'll stay in power. I mean, there's kind of a weird historical example. There were Vikings that invaded France. They also invaded Sicily. They captured Sicily, and then they're Normans, right? They're like Scandinavians. And they actually discriminated against their own group in order to pacify the two bigger populations on the island, Jews and Arabs. And they did that to stay in power, right? And this is exactly what happens with the Magdeburg Confession. The reason that they're going to be besieged a few months after they make this confession is because there was an elite man who thought that he would get more. And so he switched sides. And so who's legitimate now? So legitimacy, I think, is especially in times of strife, is going to be extremely contested. And that's not actually, the Magdeburg Confession doesn't come down by saying we're justified because this guy has no power over us.
If you're a Game of Thrones,
we're justified because we have authority to protect those who are under us, who the man above us actually wants to harm.